December 1943. The skies over northern Germany burn with tracers and smoke. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses claws its way home from a bombing run over Bremen. Two engines out. Flak holes punch through the fuselage. Oxygen masks frozen stiff from the bitter air at 25,000 feet. One of those bombers is barely holding together. The crew has stopped counting the holes. There are too many. German fighters circle like vultures, waiting for one more pass. Inside, waist gunner Sergeant Vince Evans grips the handles of his twin .50 caliber Brownings. Every muscle in his body trembles, part cold, part adrenaline. He can see the next wave coming straight at them, sunlight flashing off the enemy's nose cannons. But when the Messerschmitts close in, something strange happens. Their fire goes wide. Their attack falters. One peels away, then another. And somehow the battered American bomber keeps flying. It makes it home, against all odds, and the crew can't quite explain why. It wasn't luck. It wasn't armor. It was something their gunner had done, a quiet modification born from instinct and desperation, a trick so simple yet so effective it would change how gunners fought for the rest of the war.
To understand Vince's discovery, you first need to understand what life was like inside a B-17. They called it the Flying Fortress, but to the men inside, it often felt more like a flying coffin. At altitude, the temperature dropped below 40 degrees below zero. The roar of the engines made speech impossible. The crew relied on hand signals and the intercom that often froze solid. Every surface of the plane was metal, cold, brittle, unforgiving. And the Luftwaffe knew exactly where to hit it. German fighters didn't waste ammunition. They aimed for the wings, the cockpit, the fuel tanks, the places that would bring the whole fortress down in seconds. The B-17's armor helped, but not enough. One lucky hit could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. And in those early years, that happened far too often. Vince Evans was a farm kid from Iowa. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who fixed things that weren't his job to fix. He wasn't supposed to innovate. He was supposed to follow procedure. But procedure wasn't keeping his friends alive. On his 7th mission, Vince noticed something strange. His guns had jammed after firing a long burst, forcing him to stop and clear the belts. When he examined the barrels later, he found they'd been knocked slightly out of alignment. Bent, not broken, but bent. The mounts had loosened from vibration. And yet, when he'd fired them like that, his bullets had cut a wider path through the air that day. Not a single fighter had made it through his field of fire. Vince stayed awake that night in the hangar, studying the mounts with a flashlight and a wrench. He measured the spread. He recalibrated. And he realized something the manuals didn't say, something the engineers hadn't considered. When two .5 caliber guns fire perfectly parallel, they concentrate their fire on a small point in the sky, maybe 10 feet wide at 1,000 yards. But in combat, fighters don't fly in straight lines. They weave, roll, dive, and climb. A perfect line of bullets could easily miss. By angling the guns slightly apart, just half a degree, maybe less, Vince created a different kind of weapon. Instead of a narrow stream, his fire fanned out into a broad cone, a curtain of lead. It didn't aim to hit a single spot. It aimed to make the air itself deadly. That subtle change made all the difference.
At first, his crew thought he was reckless. Regulations were strict. You didn't modify weapon mounts in the field. But Vince wasn't guessing. He tested. He calculated. He adjusted the angles by eye, tightening the bolts until they held the new position. And the next morning, when the bombers climbed over the North Sea toward Germany, his side of the plane became a wall of noise and light. The Luftwaffe came in low, fast, confident. But as soon as they entered the range of the waist guns, their confidence vanished. The tracer pattern was chaotic, a swirling, shifting storm that filled the air like a net. The German pilots called it der Todesschirm, the death screen.
Evans' squadron started calling it the shot curtain, and soon other crews were copying it. Some tilted their guns outward by half an inch. Some wrapped cloth around the barrels to absorb recoil vibrations, which scattered the rounds even wider. Each man added his own touch, but the principle was the same: saturation. Don't aim where the enemy is, fill the space where he's going. It wasn't just theory. Mission reports started to show fewer hits on the sides of the formations where those modified guns were used. The Luftwaffe, once so deadly in head-on and belly attacks, began to pull back earlier, wasting ammunition at a distance. The B-17 hadn't changed. The men inside it had. Still, no trick could make the sky truly safe. Of every 100 airmen who flew over Europe, 55 would never return. Flak, fighters, and the endless cold took their toll. But stories spread. Stories of planes that came home against impossible odds. Crews would land, step out shaking, count the holes in the fuselage, and realize they were still breathing because the gunners had given them a chance. Vince himself flew 32 missions before rotating home. He'd been wounded twice, lost countless friends, and watched the air war evolve from chaos to coordination. And through it all, he never saw himself as an inventor. He said later, "I just wanted the sky to be a little less empty." The Army never issued official recognition for the trick. It was unofficial, unsanctioned, and quietly passed from crew to crew. But historians later found references to it in debriefing notes, combat reports, and diaries of German pilots who described unnaturally wide defensive fire. It was an innovation born not in laboratories, but in frozen aluminum corridors 30,000 feet above Europe. By 1944, American bomber losses began to drop. Part of that was better escort tactics. The arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang helped immensely. But part of it was psychological. German pilots began to dread the B-17 formations. They described them as walls of fire, impregnable masses of flame and metal. Some even believed the bombers had been fitted with new armor plating. In truth, the planes hadn't changed at all. What changed was how the men inside fought back. Evans' trick, and others like it, built the illusion of invincibility. Each bomber still had thin aluminum skin and exposed crew positions. But from the cockpit of an approaching fighter, all you saw was chaos, 1,000 glowing dots racing towards you. No one wanted to be the pilot who tested whether the flying fortress was truly bulletproof. And so, through ingenuity, rumor, and raw courage, the Americans won the air of fear, a weapon every bit as powerful as their guns. When the war ended, Vince Evans went home quietly. He returned to Iowa, married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about the missions. But when fellow veterans tracked him down years later, they thanked him, not for medals or kills, but for lives. He never claimed credit for anything. He never called it his idea. He said it was common sense, something any gunner could have seen if they'd paid attention. But in truth, it took more than that. It took the nerve to challenge procedure in the middle of war, to defy the manual when the manual wasn't working, to believe that a few degrees of difference could separate death from survival. Over time, aviation historians began referring to techniques like his as adaptive gunnery, improvised field methods that changed how defensive fire was used in combat. It's a small story in the grand scale of the Second World War. No generals, no grand strategy, no sweeping victory. Just a man, 2 guns, and a decision to see the sky differently. But sometimes that's how history moves forward, not through orders from above, but through one man's quiet defiance below. As for Vince, when a journalist once asked him what he thought of being called the gunner who made the B-17 bulletproof, he laughed softly and said, "There's no such thing as bulletproof, but you can make the bullets think twice." In the endless roar of engines, in the freezing wind over Germany, a handful of men learned to do exactly that, to make fear itself a weapon. And thanks to them, many more came home than ever should have. This was the story of a trick, a man, and the moment the Flying Fortress truly earned its name.